going to start off with a story. And I recently read online about a couple of journalists doing an experiment. And what they did is they bought an online ad on Facebook, and they targeted people who were house hunting. The distressing thing about this experiment is that they were able to exclude people who are African American, Asian American, and Hispanic from this ad. Now, this is a dreadful abuse of personal data. But I was at a conference last week, and someone came up to me afterwards and said, I completely agree, that's a horrific example you've just given. But did you know that you, as a white male, are 4 to 5 times more at risk of getting testicular cancer than a black man? And so I was like, no, that's really important knowledge. I should know that information. And what this accentuated for me is the privacy paradox we're living in right now, and the importance of rethinking how we use personal information. And this is something that is cropping up again and again, and there are really positive use cases, and data can be used for good, and there are really, really negative use cases. So today, I'm going to contend that we need to empower the crowd with their data, and that we, as digital citizens, need to have a say over who gets to use it. And this is not just a desirable shift, this is something that is inevitable. So if you look at the landscape of what's happening right now, we're kind of hitting this perfect storm of macro trends that are going to reshape the data economy. Trust is at all-time low levels, and this is largely to do with our data relationships with brands. 75% of consumers do not trust brands with their data, and this is causing a behavior change. And we see this behavior change in the advertising industry. Just over a year ago, a report came out that said there was 200 million people, or 200 million ad blockers installed across the web. Only 6 months ago, the same source said there was 500 million, 500 million people who have installed ad blockers on their smartphones. And this shows the disconnect between marketers and consumers, and that disconnect is happening through data. And what we're witnessing in advertising is probably the biggest consumer protest we've ever seen. And it's not just consumers that are taking action. It's regulators too. And so back in May this year, the EU Council ratified the GDPR. And this is a massive upgrade on the data protection regulations. And the GDPR will empower the crowd, empower us as people with better protection of our data. And for me, there's a significant financial risk for non-compliance. There's 20 million euro fine, or 4% of global revenue for non-compliance. That's a huge financial risk for businesses. And the two key things that will help empower the crowd with their data from this regulation is around consent. Businesses will have to get explicit consent every time they want to use your data. The second thing is around portability. And this is probably one of the most loosely defined aspects of the GDPR, but what this effectively means is that businesses have to give your data back to you so you can use it. And this will create a much more fluid ecosystem of data that's available to us. And we need this fluidity because if we look at how data is currently managed, it all exists in big data silos. And the worst thing about this whole scenario is there are lots of data companies that repackage and resell this data back out to businesses. And we, as consumers, don't know who they are. We don't know that this is happening. And this is part of the reason consumers are having this disconnect with marketers, and there's this level of distrust in the market. I think most of you will have experienced the following situation. You've gone and bought something online, and then for the next 3 or 4 weeks, you see an advert for exactly the same product you've just bought. And that's because there's a severe lack of fluidity in the data economy. It's because we're completely excluded from the whole marketing process. And so if you take a look at how the internet is designed, it's flat, it's open, it's distributed. And this is a model that the data economy needs to start moving towards. If you look at the data silos, effectively what we've done is taken a mass production 20th century model and very crudely bolted it on to a decentralized infrastructure. And what we're starting to see as we move deeper into the digital age, that businesses, especially this decade, that have come to the fore, come to prominence, are largely based on decentralized, distributed, crowd-based, peer-to-peer business models. And this conference is evidence enough of that shift. And I believe that with the ubiquity of smartphones and sensors and all the data APIs that we can connect to, the same will happen in the data economy. And so what happens when we're empowered with our data? I think most of us are we don't know. We don't know what the potential is of this yet. But what we do know is that as our lives become more and more digital, more and more varied data opens up to us. Now I show this diagram to a lot of different types of people and businesses and ask them what they'd connect up. And I get a really varied response. Some people say, well, I'd love to connect up my DNA data with my psychographic data because I'd love to see what part of myself is predetermined by genetics and what part of myself is the result of socialization. Other people are way more pragmatic and utilitarian about it and say, well, actually, what I'd want from my data is for it to help me make decisions. So how can I reduce my home energy bill, for example? And actually, some of the early adopters of our platform here have been energy companies and smart cities, because what they see is, well, we can use all this great personal data in an ethical way, link it all to some open data and some proprietary data that we're collecting to engage people in their local communities, to show them how they fit into the world around them. And whether the use case is either deep personal insight or something a bit more pragmatic and useful, what is clear is that we cannot do this in the old world of big data silos. We need to move to a more distributed, empowered, crowd-based model. For clear security risks, I don't think any of us would want to see all this data sitting in one place, but also because data needs to be more fluid throughout our different life contexts. And so the kind of digital era today it's not always about building the biggest, but a lot of the time it is about managing the flows. And if you look at the businesses, again, that have come to the fore this decade, you see companies like Uber, who are basically just managing the flows of supply and demand, and Airbnb, who don't own any property, but again, are managing the flows of supply and demand. And I believe the same is going to happen in the data economy. And this is all happening right now. A consultancy based in London called Control Shift, they track hundreds of companies, or companies that they call Personal Information Management Services, or PIMS for short. And they're not just small companies, they're big brands too. And these types of companies are empowering people with their data, and there are hundreds of them. And they valued this market at £16.5 billion, and that's just in the UK. Citizen Me are a PIMS company. As far as I know, we're the first data company that do not store any data at all. All the data from our users is stored on their smartphone and backed up to a personal cloud. We then allow people to exchange their data with organizations or businesses anonymously for some kind of value exchange, typically cash rewards or some kind of personal insight. And if we're going to make this whole personal data, crowd-based data economy work, we need to really, really understand and get to grips with the value exchange. And the value for businesses is an integrated, single source way of collecting data. Single source in the sense that there's lots of data and APIs that exist about us in lots of different places, and there's the good old-fashioned kind of question and answer format of collecting data. And it's about pulling all that into one single place. And businesses buy this information already, but for multiple suppliers. What PIMS can do is take a more integrated and richer approach and more automated approach to handling this kind of business need. And they do it by going directly to the source, as people. And what's more, they can do that in a way that gains consent every time that data is used, which makes it GDPR compliant, and give back a bit of the value to the user in form of cash rewards. And so the value exchange for us as people, the owners of data, is monetary value. Our data is worth something to some businesses. And if our data has some monetary value, we can donate that data and the money we get from that data back to charities and non-for-profits. And that's why some of the smart city initiatives are interested in this platform, because we can engage people through a trusted data relationship and an ethical data exchange that connects people to their communities. But I think the most interesting value exchange for us as people is the value we get at an emotional and utilitarian level. I talked at the start about what our data says about us, and what we're doing about that right now is we're helping people understand what their personalities look like across lots of different social networks. So we're running psychographic profiles for people based on what they like and post on Twitter and Facebook. And this gives people a different reflection of themselves across the different channels they work in, and helps them manage their identities in an increasingly complex world. But what is more interesting, I think, is when we move to something a bit more utilitarian with our data. The next natural step for me with this data is helping people understand what their data can do for them. So when people are empowered with their data, there's no reason why we can't look to invert some of that direct response advertising model for certain products and services. If I know a lot about myself already, there's no reason why I can't take that data with a digital assistant to help me take that data to market and ask companies to come to me. And we can meet in the middle and have a fair exchange. So for example, if I own a small sports car, do 10,000 miles a year, but have just changed life stage and need a bigger car to accommodate a new family, that is a really profiled, rich, qualified lead for businesses. So if I take that to market, businesses don't need to guess by targeting adverts to who they think are going to buy their products. They can just engage with me directly. And this, I believe, is the shift that we need to make. This is what is going to help us rebalance the data economy. This is where the empowered crowd meet a commercial sector that better understand and can respond to our everyday needs. And so, in summary, I think the way that we use data right now, this kind of more lopsided, one-sided approach where businesses own our data and push things out to us, it is open to abuse. There's lots of great things that we do with it, don't get me wrong. I love a lot of the services out there, but it is open to abuse. And so I do think we need to change that and react to some of the really best practice that's out there in the sharing economy, the collaborative economy, and the crowd economy. And I believe there is a better way for all of us, a better way for all of us as digital citizens, and a better way for all of us as business leaders. And that is an approach where the data economy is decentralized and distributed, where we are empowered with our data. Thank you. Thank you.
Let's open up for a question, perhaps. We have some time. Anyone have a question for Ryan? Tammy, can you please hand the microphone? The microphone is not working. Is it working?
No, there it is.
There we go.
That was amazing. I'm totally in love with these concepts. What is the hurdle that needs to be overcome in order to make this vision happen?
The hurdle is scale. It's about these small companies finding enough businesses to engage with this. Luckily, we are at a point where, as I said earlier, consumer sentiment is getting worse and worse and worse, and new regulation is coming in that businesses are way more receptive to this than they were a couple of years ago. I remember doing a similar kind of presentation 2 or 3 years ago, and everyone in the room just looked at me thinking I was absolutely crazy. But right now, we're getting so much interest in this kind of model. And so the biggest challenge is because it's a two-sided model. Consumers want this, so we're not necessarily seeing much of an obstacle on that side of the equation. It's more of the obstacle on the other side of the equation. And there are some really, really forward-thinking businesses right now that are starting to engage and adopt with this. And there are some very, very big brands that are starting to explore and innovate in this area as well, which is increasingly exciting. So, but I think that's probably the biggest hurdle for making this happen.
Great.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks, Ryan. Appreciate that. Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you.
Yes.
This is for you.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.